Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Andrea Balis and Elizabeth Levy, the authors of Witch Hunt, The Cold War, Joe McCarthy, and the Red Scare. Dr. Balis is at John Jay, has directed theater, and has written a novel for teenagers. And Elizabeth Levy has written over 100 books for children and young adults and worked for the Bobby Kennedy for President campaign. And that is the one in
Senator,
1968.
I was going to say 1968, Senator Kennedy.
I pretended I was going to leave it up to chance, but Bobby Kennedy for president in 1968. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. The most important character in this book isn't a person. It's not even real. It's the proverbial fly on the wall. This book is written screenplay style and features a narrator that has been given the title The Fly on the Wall. Andrea and Elizabeth, if I may call you by your first names, you say that the fly on the wall can only exist in this format, that it's not possible to witness what happens in one place at one time and truly understand everything. This book is written for middle schoolers, which, by the way, is the first time we've had a book written for middle schoolers on this podcast. So not sure who wants to take this, but why do you believe the fly on the wall theory is critical for middle schoolers to understand? And why is middle school such a fertile time to learn not just history, but how history is studied?
Why don't you take it on?
Um, the problem with history, when we read history, whether we're in a middle school or not, is that you need so much context. You need to know so much that's going on around the events that you're reading about for them to make sense. But if you can easily get bogged down in that context also and lose the story that you are reading in the first place. The Fly solves all those problems because the Fly enables us to explain as a fly on the wall to history, explain the context in which things are happening, since the fly is everywhere and knows everything and hears everything. The Fly can easily provide the background, the history. In this book, which talks about McCarthyism and the witch hunt, we needed to talk about we needed to talk about the Red Scare. We needed to talk about World War II. We needed to talk about the atom bomb. We need to talk about a lot of things in order to make the story, to give the story its place in time. And so we use the Fly as a device for that.
Elizabeth, why is middle school such an important time, not just to learn history, but to learn how history is studied?
Because history is happening to you as children. I don't think it's just for middle school. Children do know a lot about what's going on, but they know that adults aren't telling them the whole story. And so I want to give my readers and me a window into how it feels to live at that time. One of the things that I love that Andrea says, Andrea, your favorite thing about, let you take it about that history, what can't you do in history?
You can't read ahead. You don't know what's going to happen next. We really don't know who's going to win this election. We really don't. And yet, 6 months from now or a year from now, it's going to be obvious who was going to win this
Right. How
election.
could we not have seen that? Right. Yeah. What were
Right.
we thinking?
Yes.
Um, yeah. I had a brilliant English teacher in middle school. His name was Jeff Crumper. I went to Manhattan East on 100th Street and First Avenue. His most anticipated lesson was Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And we spent weeks reading that book and writing about that book. Why do you think it is that middle school is the perfect time to begin to understand the concept of groupthink and the dangers of paranoia and hysteria?
Because you do know what it's like to be picked on unfairly. You do know what it's like to have people whisper about your family unfairly. All of those things that made, the crucible so crucial. And as Andrea studying history, it was not really as much the kids spreading rumors about who was witches. And what we try to do by letting you hear the voices of the people who are living it is to understand that it's never quite as simple as you think. And I think kids understand that. They understand fairness, but you really also understand when you're being bullied that there's not a good reason for it all.
Andrea, what's your view of that?
Well, I think one of the things, that we tried to do in this book was we went and we interviewed people who were kids during the McCarthy period and got what they remember as children, how frightening it was, how mysterious it was, how inexplicable it was to them as children. And we try and pass that on as well. We talk a lot about collateral damage, that the people who are affected by something aren't the people only who are in headlines. They're not the people in this case who necessarily got called before Congress. They're the people who got whispered about. They're the people who whispered about other people.
One of my favorite interviews was someone who said when her mother was called to the House of Un-American Activities, she thought it was a house that her mother would have to go in as American and come out as something else. So, and
the question was what?
Exactly.
You say that communism is the one thing in America in the 1950s that you simply could not afford to be known as. First of all, before we get to that part of it, what are the roots of communism? Where does communism come from? What does it mean?
Andrea, you take that.
Okay, communism is an economic and political theory that starts in the middle of the 19th century. And that's at a time when industrialization is sweeping the world and people are being increasingly chained to machines. And Marx, looking at the world around him, saw how people and the machinery of industrialization were wrapped around each other. And he proposed that the people who did the work, the workers in factories, should be the people who benefited the most from the factory and the output of the factory, not the people who owned the factory, because it was the other people who were the producers.
And how did he see those resources being distributed in society?
The thing about Marxism is that it's a 19th century political theory, and a lot of the details aren't worked out. So he had slogans, he had ideas about how this might happen, but he actually it hadn't been tried. In the middle of the 19th century, a lot of people in Europe, a lot of countries in Europe, in fact, tried to experiment with ways that they could try the ideas of socialism and communism in their states. It didn't work.
And you have to understand, one, it was an exciting time for most of the parents. The revolution had happened, in their lifetime. And then the Depression. So they saw so many people losing jobs, looking for something that would be fair. Robert Oppenheimer talks about that. We have other people who talked about, yes, their father went to communist parties and wanted housing to be fair in the middle of the Depression, but he also probably went to meet girls. That's the mix that we want our readers and all readers of history to know.
What are the roots of witch hunts? We've got the roots of communism, but what are the historical roots of witch hunts? Is it really just like Salem at the end of the 17th century?
Well, there were plenty of witch hunts, not just in Salem. It was a big activity for several hundred years.
As a hobby.
Yes, it's really handy to label someone who's in your way as a witch. It's just really a handy thing. And it's pretty easy to convince yourself that that's what's happening, that that person has somehow an unfair advantage, that something is not quite right. A lot of the times, what happened in witch trials is that people who had property who other people wanted They were accused of being witches. People who didn't necessarily, in Salem, the people who were accused of witches were the people who were involved in the new commerce, were involved in they lived near the road to and from Salem, the big Salem highway, and they were shipping goods out. That changed the whole nature of the colony, and they were bewitching it. They
And
were
I think
destroying it.
in terms of our book, the witch hunts are all usually for people who are powerless. Most of the people who are hunted as witches do not have as much power as the hunters do. And so that is the point of our use of that title in this book.
All right, so we've got communism down, we've got witch hunts down. Now let's talk about the fear of communists in the 1900s. How did that fear begin to take hold and when?
Well, the communists called for worldwide communist revolution in the 19th century. They said it out loud and they said everybody should participate. But by the 20th century, when McCarthyism occurs, it has hardened into a political structure. It has, by that point, we're talking now about two camps of the world divided between the USSR by that point and the United States, countries, one system dominated by communism and the other opposed to it. So by the middle of the 20th century, it's taken on its own 20th century form.
And you have to also remember that it takes a little political form too. FDR, the Democrats had been in power for a long time. FDR had 4 terms, then Truman. So, the Republican, they wanted to get the power back.
And
It,
what exactly was the basis for this fear? Explain what was going on in the world and why there was this ability to make a sale in America that communism was simply dangerous and must be rooted out.
Well, this is the place where the fly comes in so handy, because the fly can explain that at the end of World War II, although Russia and the United States had been allies during World War II, that alliance fell apart at the end of the war. And Russia was marching from the east and gobbling up, you can say gobbling up in a middle school book, gobbling up Eastern Europe as it went along. So this was not a fantasy that came out of nowhere. There were significant events that were going on. China was in the midst of a revolution that had been already going on for 30 years, and an attempt to change their form of government and get rid of the European influences. So
And
and once you build up fear, it's easy to just let it fly, as the fly in the wall does. Black veterans coming back from World War II thought they had defeated racism because of Nazism, were met by even stronger racism when they got back here. And so then the civil rights movement gets labeled as communist. One of our favorites that we start the book with is in Indiana, they tried to ban any books about Robin Hood because he stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And that was the communist line. And our favorite people who fought back, and Andrea loves this, these students, okay, you can do the chicken feathers.
okay, so that we're always looking, of course, as good historians do, for the resistance. And there were enough people who rose up in Robin Hood's defense that the students in Indiana, when Indiana decided to remove Robin Hood from state libraries, a bunch of students from the University of Indiana went to a nearby chicken farm, filled sacks up with chicken feathers, dyed them green in honor of Robin Hood, and threw them off the balcony of the state legislature to express their opinion about Robin Hood and his communistic tendencies.
which people in America were particularly vulnerable to this argument that communists and communism had to be stopped at all costs?
It was often teachers, librarians. It was not the powerful. It was some people in government. the Hollywood writers, but it really was your fear of Harry Belafonte, of entertainers being Black, of teachers, that your teacher was going to somehow turn you. One of our favorite stories and very sad ones was a second grade teacher who'd been in the Communist Party in the 30s, left it, loved teaching the Pledge of Allegiance. But the FBI found her that she had been once a member of the Communist Party, though she had left it, and the school board fired her. And not only that, but then when she got a job at the SPCA cleaning out dog poop, excuse me, but no kid book without
Teach.
the word, no good book without the word poop is ever loses. She got fired from the SPCA.
Hmm. I want to go. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, please,
That's
Andrea.
it. That's yeah.
Well, and it's even more complicated than that because the way people got the names of people to go after was by pressuring the people who they arrested to give them names of people who in their community who might be, who had been, who had gone to a meeting, who they thought had done something suspicious, who they thought knew how to speak Russian.
Hmm.
And that kind of pressure changed society.
I have a couple questions before we get back to our plot here. I have a couple of questions about you and how you both put this book together. First of all, Elizabeth, how did Bringing Down a President, that's the title of a previous book you've written, how did Bringing Down a President lead you to this? I was thinking about Nixon and I thought to myself, well, Nixon got brought down by his own paranoia as opposed to the paranoia of others.
I I think it really I love stories. Obviously, I've been a storyteller from the beginning. But in the 70s, I worked in theater with Andrea and had, as I've often said, more fun and made less money than even in children's books. But I knew Andrea would become an historian, and I just missed working with her, quite honestly. And we just went to meet again and we started thinking of what stories don't get told to kids, partly because, I'm sure you remember from school, you very rarely get even within 50 or 100 years of history. So,
Right.
contemporary history. And the Watergate story was such a good story to tell, both about the mix and the unexpectedness of history. That's what I think we really want kids to understand, that it is you have to live life as it's not a straight line, and you have to accept that that's part of what we're going to live through. They're going to live through in the histories that they live through, and we all live through.
Uh, Dr. Balis, I'm curious, does being trained at the PhD level help you write for young teens, or is that training something you have to fight against as you struggle to find their ear?
What where I learned to do this kind of writing was from teaching basic courses in the City University system, in City University of New York. I taught survey courses, history survey courses for years and years. And I became aware of how much was missing. And I also became aware of how incredibly hard it was for students to learn anything because history is one of the more history you know, the easier it is to learn history. If you don't have a structure or the example I always use for students is it's like having a big walk-in closet. Everything you know is in there, but you'll never find it. I mean, what you need are shelves and drawers and rods to hang things up on. And without that, it's meaningless. So as I taught, I began to look for ways in which there were signposts. I'm a 20th century historian. Signposts in 20th century history that you could use to mark a place and sort of build out from there.
very curious about sources here because it's such an interestingly designed book. What did you consult with and cite from, and how did you construct this narrative? And either of you can take it, or you both can take it.
We interviewed people. That's where some of it comes from. I have a PhD in history. Did I not mention that? I mean, I do have a sense of where you can go for history. I do know how to go to the National Archives and find things. I mean, I'm legitimately trained.
Uh, and I majored in history. I think one of the main though things is that every quote is footnoted, and we gathered quotes, but we're magpies. I mean, and even Andrea is an historian. We bring each other little treats. Look, this is funny. This is good. Look what so and so said. Uh, and we build it up from there, which we really used to build plays up like that, Andrea. It really, you find the little gold in there, and something like the feathers. That book was never going to not have that in there.
And we found it because we found out that books were banned under, we knew books were banned, sort of interested in book banning. And I went and looked at what the list was, and the first name I got to was, can you believe it, Liz? Robin Hood was, can you believe it? And there we were, off and running.
Fascinating. Why did you do this screenplay style as opposed to a first or third person type narrative?
Ah, it worked. Hello, there you are. Andrew here, and this is Shandor.
Hello.
We've got a brand new season of the Family Histories podcast for you with another 7 fascinating guests who'll be telling us about their secretive granny, a brave sailor, a political poet, a merchant seaman, a priestly lover, a resistance member, and a magnificent aunt that they've discovered in their family trees. And did I mention that there's a secret time machine? No, of course I didn't. Anyway, search for the Family Histories podcast after this episode to join us on our trip back in time. Okay, you can switch it off now.
I think history gets boring when you see huge blocks of type and you can't differentiate between what's, really happening at the moment and not. And I think maybe it's because we had done theater. It just seemed right for us once we came up with that idea. And
also, we're really interested in this. People memorize speeches that politicians say. They lie. I mean, that part of it is we wanted readers to see the words that these people said because they said them. It's an accurate quote, but they were lying. And when we talk about critical thinking, one of the things that we're trying to make people understand is you have to consider, yes, they said it. Does that mean it's true?
And I think kids can have fun making their own little history projects, both interviewing people they know and finding real quotes about the time, and then putting it together almost like a Twitter. It makes history less. Find a word for me, Andrea.
It celebrates the fragmentness of it instead of being shattered by it. I mean, it helps you see that it's like a kaleidoscope, and that's the fun of it.
Why do you think learning to do history, learning where history comes from and how it's constructed is so important, in addition to just maybe learning a list of dates or learning, as you said, a list of quotes from certain political leaders?
Yeah, learning the list of dates is pretty useless. And learning the list of quotes doesn't do anything except it may strengthen your memory. But it's getting a sense of the movement through time of how things changed over time and of the complexity of change. That's really important.
And how hard it is to do change, but also exciting for the people who are living through it. So that I do love Andrea's thing that you don't know what's going to happen, but there is a comfort in hearing what people live through and how imperfect all of us are.
You've
And
both, yeah, you've both talked a lot about living through history and how we're all sort of going through this time together. Uh, what events are most exciting to both of you? Is it electoral history? Is it when someone discovers something amazing? Is it an event like landing on the moon? For you, what ruffles your feathers?
okay, Andrea, you take it first. Oh,
Yes, you notice how she's
I can think.
You know what? For me, it's how they fit together. It's not the individual pieces. It's the way that it's how they slip slide together. It's, oh my God, this was happening at the same time. How that's a whole other way of looking at it. And on the other hand, people were dancing on their heads while this was going on. And what could that mean? And in the shiftingness of time, what does that mean?
And I think what excites me is the the play between politics of protest and wanting to move things forward and politics of actually getting things done in Congress, and how they play all the time together and not always in an evil way at all. And so I think that's nobody, Eisenhower and Truman were heroes to me, but they also were not perfect in trying to contain McCarthyism. They probably caused more harm to people, but they still were heroes. And kids and all of us have to learn that.
All right, so back to our plot. Perfect segue there. What made Joe McCarthy the perfect vessel to channel this paranoia? Who is Joe McCarthy? Who was Joe McCarthy? And where did he come from?
Wisconsin. He came from Wisconsin. He was a charismatic man with ambition. And from a very early age, he was both. And he finagled and wiggled around to get himself notoriety as tail gunner Joe during World War II, despite the fact that he was not a tail gunner. And he was good at self promotion. He was a modern man, and he was looking for an issue, looking for a crusade, looking for something that he could ride to fame and fortune. And it was communism. It could have been ballet dancing.
Some people are probably sorry he didn't take up dancing. How did the fight against, well, let me start with him. How did he position himself and communism as something to be fought against?
Well, well, I love the accidents of history. So here he was, a new senator. He came in with John Kennedy and Richard Nixon in the same class of 1948. And he wanted everybody to pay attention to him. He tried to hold a press conference the first day he went. He made friends with all the elevator people. Anyhow, they were giving out speeches like now in a campaign thing, and whether you're going to go to an important place. He got the lowest one you could get of any senator. He was going to be sent to talk to the Ladies Auxiliary at Wheeling, West Virginia. This is not the speech that you want to get to make headlines. But people who are accusing the State Department of having communists in them always were vague. He decided that he would make up a number, and literally, I mean, make it up. And he said, I have here a list of 221. Look, they never, Andrew, you know the thing about recording it, so I'll let you. So about history isn't always recorded.
So this is the speech that launched Joe McCarthy's career when he said that he knew the names of these people who were active communists and they were in our State Department and something had to be done about it. And he had that list of their names. And um, and it we don't know what the list was. The list was always in another pocket or in his briefcase that he'd left somewhere. No one ever saw that list.
And a podcast.
There's no record,
I'm
and
sorry.
there's no record of the speech.
Yeah, they erased it because they used to erase tapes. It was not a conspiracy. You must know that sometimes podcasts get erased. And then by the time he got on a flight, the fact that he had actually named 200 a number made it exciting. So reporters all, met him at the plane and he said, "Oh, it's in my other pocket. I left it in the suitcase." And so in between drinks he never could find the list. And finally when he got back to Washington, J. Edgar Hoover said, "Never give an exact number." So he yelled at him.
I like that ploy. How did the fight against him take shape? Who starts to fight back?
Margaret Chase Smith, the voice of the conscience of the Senate, the only woman in the Senate at that time, the senator from Maine, who was the first person to raise the point in the Senate, on the floor of the Senate, that what Joe McCarthy was doing by smearing people, by calling them communists, was destroying the very essence of free speech and the very meaning of the United States Constitution. And she made an eloquent speech. She had almost no followers, and Joe McCarthy laughed.
And then you're in the news business. There were reporters like Edward R. Murrow, who found a young Air Force reservist whose father was Serbian and bought Serbian newspapers, and Serbia was part of the communist bloc. And his sister had bought records of Paul Robeson, which kids won't know, but was a very famous singer who was had communist things. So the Air Force told them that he should resign from the Air Force because his father read Serbian newspapers. And he said, "I'm not going to." And it was a teeny little article. And one of the people who worked for Edgar R. Murrow found this and said, "This is what we've been looking for." So that was the first See It Now that they did. And then I think what we want adults and kids to know, accidents happen in history. Roy Cohn, who was McCarthy's, right-hand man, hired a young man. You want to take David Shine, Andrea?
The thing that brought McCarthy down in the end are a series of hearings, but that are the Army McCarthy hearings. And if we're telling the story, we can tell it in a minute. But the truth is, what brought McCarthy down was Eisenhower having had enough, was the fact that one of the things McCarthy started to do was attack other Republicans. When McCarthy was attacking only Democrats, he had support from the Republican Party, is where regular old party politics comes in. But he started to attack Republicans. And at that point, the Republican Party moved in to try and gain some control over that. The actual hearings that brought him down were because of the fact that the famous Roy Cohn, the lawyer that our former president would like to have as his lawyer, who was engineering a good deal of this McCarthy campaign. Roy Cohn had a friend who was in the Army, and he wanted to make sure that the friend didn't get sent overseas. He corrupted Army institutions.
The famous quote from the hearings is, "Have you any decency?" Why do you think it is that that question sort of seared through all of these debates and has lasted well into the 21st century?
I I think it really started with the fairness. If my son is going to have to be drafted into the army and peel potatoes, why should this young man be left out of the army? And then how they have no decency. One of the lawyers who worked actually for the army, this was not about communism at all. It really was whether McCarthy had done undue influence to try to get David Schein out of the army. And one of the young lawyers had worked for a left-wing organization. And they had, Andrea, you take the deal about that they had made.
So what happened is this young lawyer gets attacked, and becomes another piece of collateral damage. But what had happened by then was the hearings were on TV. People got to see McCarthy. They had already gotten to see that he was not quite the heroic figure that he was painting himself out to be. They heard his silly giggle. They saw that he looked a little bit seedy. He was an emperor who suddenly was naked. And all of a sudden, he was there and he was naked and no one wanted to talk to him anymore, and it all just slipped away.
As we pick up the pieces of all this and we start to survey the damage, what was the end result? Whose lives were ruined by these, for the lack of a better term, witch hunts?
Many gay people, because very falsely they Hoover convinced, and if you read enough about history, but Hoover was convinced that gay people in the government might have blackmail against them. It would probably be Hoover would blackmail them. One of the most poignant was a woman who could have been the first woman admiral. And she was afraid to take the job because if she felt at that point, if it came out that she was gay and she would lose the job, it was known as the Lavender Scare. It turned out that not one person was blackmailed, nor was one person a communist who got fired because of that. That's one. But on the other hand, and that's why we love history so much, out of that came some people who fought back. Andrea, take it.
No, I think that it is true that there were people who fought back, but it left an insidious trail of suspicion. And the groups that were targeted were familiar groups, feminists, African Americans, particularly those involved in political action, socialists or liberals of any kind, teachers, a group who are easy to target. Those were the groups who suffered the most, but we all suffered. When Vietnam War started, there was nobody left in the State Department who spoke Vietnamese. They had all been purged. So we all suffered.
When a middle schooler closes this book and they've read it, maybe written a paper on it, what do you hope is the next lesson of history that they move on to?
That they would be skeptical of any history that's being taught to them, that they would always look to see what the other side was, that they'd always pick up the rocks to see what crawled out from underneath, and that they would understand that the complexity of how these events are woven, how they're presented in the historical record, and how that can be changed. The historical record, the way we interpret these things, that changes. Over time, we see events in our past differently. And that reshaping of history that revision of history is a really important piece of how our society evolves and moves forward and our political process changes.
And I would hope they'd also look into history in their own families and around them. I was just a judge on a national history project for middle school kids. And one of the best was somebody, which I didn't know, the resistance to the Nazis during World War II was the strongest in Greece. They held out the longest, and she was able to interview her grandparents, and then actually they raised money and got they learned wonderful details that the more they heard about this story, the more they wanted to do exactly what we wanted the fly to do. They wanted the context, they wanted to learn more, and it was exciting. And I think that's the kind of thrill you can get with learning that I would hope.
I would hope that the readers of these books read understanding that history is gossip. That when the history is not a string of dates, history is gossip about dead people. And we want to find out what they thought, what they did, what they wore. We want to find out who they hated, who they liked, what they whispered behind someone else's back. That's what makes history real for us. And it's People magazine of the past. And it's legitimate to look at it that way.
What advice do either of you have for people who are teaching middle schoolers, whether it's parents or teachers?
I've been around so wonderful teachers who really respect your kids and your students and respect their minds and can find. I had freedom in my elementary school to always choose a project. And once they do, let that kid go into it deeply. Let them, find their way. And there are so many teachers like that. They really are, that have that curiosity about what's making their kids curious. And find that and nurture it and help them do a project that's fun.
Andrea?
I go with fun. Absolutely. Find a way to make it fun and find a way to make it complicated at the same time. And because, that's the fun.
When we give kids we print out parts of our book that we think are fun, and we have them come up in class. They don't even have to have read it at all before. And they get to be Joe McCarthy. They get to be Edward R. Murrow. They get to be one of these teachers. And they'll act it out right. They're living history right then.
Is there something happening in contemporary history, contemporary politics today that you look at, that you're already laughing, that you pick
I'm
up?
I'm already trying to hide.
You've already got answer after answer. I just, when you pick up this book and you say to them, this is the lesson from this book that we can all use today, what would it be?
That free speech is fragile, that protecting democracy is an active and ongoing process, that it requires commitment, that it does have principles and a logic behind it. I think that history does not repeat. People are wrong. You don't learn history because then it won't repeat. It will repeat. But people are people, but you can learn from the errors of the past. You can temper what happens and allow it to give you wisdom.
All right. So take your fly on the wall thing and cross it right out. I want to ask a question to both of you. Which historical event do you wish you could have been a fly on the wall for?
Oh,
I'm declaring it possible. I'm declaring it possible. You can be a fly on the wall for something. Forget learning every single thing about it. What would you have wanted to see that you didn't get to see? But be right there for it, not just alive for it. see it.
I have to admit, I'm a nerd. I'd like to see the Constitutional Convention. I'd like to get to go to the Constitutional Convention. I'd like to hear them talk about it.
Yeah, no, and I was actually a nerd and also I had a crush on Alexander Hamilton. If you look at the $10 bill, he's got way before Lin-Manuel Miranda, though he did it brilliantly. If you look at the $10 bills, he's got very high cheekbones. He was born poor in West Indies. I just ended up having a crush on him, and especially when he was very young, 17 to 20, fighting in the Revolutionary War, being an aide de camp to Washington, and the dirty jokes they told. I remember going to my professor, and I couldn't believe reading the letters that there were dirty jokes in there. And they really are. And also, Ben Franklin loved dirty jokes. So yes, I think that's, it is nerdy of me, but that's probably.
I don't know what you want to hear, the dirty jokes through history, Liz. I don't think that's quite so nerdy.
Mine's a bit of a downer, to be honest with you.
What is it?
I would like to have been in the World Trade Center on September 10th, 2001, to see the people and to talk to them and just sort of remember what life was like before that horrible day. Such a downer for the end of an episode, but
no, it isn't, because I've also taught, you had students, and Andrea teaches, police officers and firefighters at John Jay. I've lived in New York, lived through it, and I talked to many kids, and I would always try to remind them, we lost so many, but 20,000 people helped each other down those staircases. It really is amazing. People weren't trampled. Yes, history can be very sad, but the other side of it is always there.
Elizabeth, I have one note for you, and that is let's go Mets.
Yes. I think because our expectations are low this year, I have a happier idea that it could, this way it's going to be a surprise.
I love it. I'll take it. Dr. Andrea Balis and Elizabeth Levy, the authors of Witch Hunt, The Cold War, Joe McCarthy, and the Red Scare. Thank you so much for being with us.
And thank you, Evan. And thanks for being a Mets fan.
There you go. You'll always have that for me.
And if you come to New York,
always have the Mets.
We can go together. I'm bringing a bunch of children's book people out on Tuesday. We have
nice
flights.
Nice. Have a great time. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.